Indigenous Peoples, Themes and Challenges, plus the syllabus overview. The themes and challenges to be incorporated throughout this topic include the impact of state sovereignty in encouraging cooperation and resolving conflict in regard to Indigenous peoples, issues of compliance and non compliance, laws relating to Indigenous peoples as a reflection of changing values and ethical standards, the role of law reform in recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples, the effect of legal and non legal responses in achieving justice for Indigenous peoples. Let's break down these themes and challenges. These will form as part of your essay questions, and understanding them will hence help you link everything back in your learning to these key focuses. The impact of state sovereignty in encouraging cooperation and resolving conflict in regard to Indigenous peoples. State sovereignty refers to the notion that states should be able to determine how to run their own internal affairs and govern international interferences, and international interferences is discouraged. This point is basically about how state sovereignty might impact the ability for nation states to engage in cooperation and in the resolution of conflict when it concerns issues of indigenous peoples' rights and liberties. The idea is that state sovereignty can form as limitations as it acts as a barrier for international interference in affairs and hence produces a barrier to the effectiveness of international obligations and pressures from the international community to an extent. At the end of this elective, you have to assess the extent to which state sovereignty is a limitation or, alternatively, is able to be overcome. Issues of compliance and non compliance. This one is pretty basic. It's just about how there is an issue of compliance and non compliance towards fulfilling international obligations to protect, promote, and enforce Indigenous rights and liberties, and generally towards the ways in which nation states are able to recognize these rights in the first place. In other words, international obligations are the best criteria to judge this by. Laws relating to Indigenous peoples are as a reflection of changing values and ethical standards. This is similar to your previous themes and challenges, where you were not just evaluating the law as being this evolving mechanism meant to reflect the views of the majority, but focusing also on how the law should reflect our evolved conscience around the civil, cultural, economic, and political rights of Indigenous peoples. The role of law reform is in recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples. Links back to the previous theme and challenge. The idea that law reform is essential to reflecting the changing ethical and moral standards of society. The effectiveness of the legal and non-legal responses in achieving justice for Indigenous peoples. This is quite self-explanatory. You're evaluating the impact of legislation, so laws, domestic ratification of conventions and treaties, plus actual statute law and courts, some IGOs like International Criminal Court, and non-legal responses such as media, NGOs, international instruments. In assessing effectiveness, it is important to discern the actual impact that legal and non-legal responses have in recognizing, promoting, and enforcing and protecting Indigenous peoples' rights. This becomes relevant for your contemporary issues. So students learn about the nature of law and Indigenous peoples, and the definition of Indigenous peoples, loss of rights of Indigenous peoples over time, legal recognition of Indigenous peoples, importance of the right to self-determine, of importance of the right to self-determination. Students learn to define, outline the loss of, so define Indigenous peoples, outline the loss of rights of Indigenous peoples globally, outline the need for legal recognition of Indigenous peoples, and explain the difficulties faced by Indigenous peoples in determining their own future. Use the traffic light system in your review of each topic to see if you can answer the questions to the right in a manner that is 90% to 100% accurate, which is green, 60 to 85% accurate, which is yellow, or will still be struggling to answer, such as red and orange. Responses to Indigenous peoples. The roles of the national state and state sovereignty, the United Nations, international instruments, courts, intergovernmental organizations, non-government organizations, the media, and Australia's federal structure. So you'll have to examine the role of sovereignty in assisting and impeding the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples, evaluate the effectiveness of legal and non-legal measures in achieving justice for Indigenous peoples, Explain the role of Australia's federal structure in responding to the needs of Indigenous peoples. Contemporary issues concerning Indigenous peoples. The issues that must be studied include loss of cultural rights, including language, land rights, legal rights to natural resources, intellectual property rights. So you'll have to identify and investigate these contemporary issues involving the rights of Indigenous peoples and evaluate the effectiveness of the legal and non-legal responses to these issues. So essentially, you're trying to see cases where perhaps these rights have not been upholded, and you're going to be evaluating whether the legal system and the non-legal system has adequately responded to these issues.